don't care what the schedule says. Find me another co-pilot or this plane stays on the ground. Captain Jackson Wilson's voice cut through the pre-flight briefing room like a blade, silencing all other conversations. In exactly 47 minutes, Captain Jackson Wilson would discover that the black woman he'd just humiliated in front of the entire flight crew didn't just outrank him. She owned every aircraft in the fleet, including the one they were standing in. His entire career reputation and identity would collapse faster than a plane in an unrecoverable dive. But for now, his confidence remained unshaken, his authority unchallenged. His perfectly pressed uniform gleamed with pins and honors from 3 decades of flying, each one a shield he wielded against change. First Officer Jasmine Bennett stood motionless, her credentials folder still extended in midair, her expression a practiced mask of professional neutrality. Around them, flight attendants and ground crew froze eyes darting between the veteran captain and the new co-pilot he was publicly rejecting. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Denver International Airport, snow fell in delicate flakes, gathering momentum. Weather delays already threatened the day's schedule. Now this, a human storm brewing inside. Captain Wilson Jasmine began, her voice measured. Controlled, my qualifications exceed company requirements by I make the final call on who flies with me. Wilson interrupted, not even glancing at her documentation. It's my aircraft, my responsibility. The irony of his statement hung in the air, unrecognized by everyone in the room. His aircraft. If only he knew. Denver to Chicago Meridian Airways Flight 2733. A routine 2-hour journey across America's heartland. On the manifest, 178 passengers, 6 crew members, and enough prejudice to ground a Boeing 787. Have you ever witnessed someone use their position to dismiss another's qualifications without even looking at them? Comment your experience below. And if this moment made your stomach tighten with that familiar feeling of injustice, hit subscribe and give the video a like. Now let's rewind to how this confrontation really started and why the next hour would permanently transform an entire industry. Jasmine Bennett arrived at the airport 3 hours before departure, as she had for every flight of her 18-year career. At 38, she carried herself with the poised confidence that came from breaking barriers first, as one of few black women in Air Force flight training, then through combat deployments, and now in commercial aviation, still overwhelmingly white and male cockpits. Her credentials were impeccable. Graduated top of her class at the Air Force Academy, logged over 12,000 flight hours, including combat missions over hostile territory. Perfect safety record certified on 7 different aircraft types. But experience had taught her that credentials alone were never enough. Not when you looked like her. Morning Ms. Bennett called the security guard at crew entrance. Early as always. Jasmine smiled warmly. Best part of the day, Leon. How's your daughter doing at UNC? Crushing it made Dean's list again. He beamed with pride. She's got your picture on her wall, you know. Says she wants to fly too. These small moments sustained her reminders of why she endured the extra scrutiny, the constant proving and reproving of her capabilities. It wasn't just about flying anymore. It was about who would fly after her. What nobody at Meridian Airways knew, what only 7 people in the world knew, was that Jasmine Bennett was no ordinary pilot. 6 months ago, through a complex series of investment vehicles and a brilliantly executed acquisition strategy, she had become majority owner of Meridian Airways. The purchase had been deliberately kept quiet, managed through holding companies that obscured her identity. Not to trick anyone, but to observe to see the airline's true culture before announcing changes. Today she wore simple professional attire rather than her uniform dark slacks, a navy blazer over a crisp white shirt. Her pilot's uniform hung in her roller bag to be changed into before briefing. The subtle transition helped her gather intelligence from both worlds, corporate and operational, without drawing attention. As she wheeled her bag toward the crew lounge, memory flashed 14-year-old Jasmine face pressed against the fence at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, watching planes take off, declaring to her father she'd fly one day. "That's not for people like us," an aging white flight instructor had commented, overhearing her dream. "Takes a certain kind of person to be trusted with all those lives." Her father, a mathematics professor, had squeezed her shoulder. "He's right about one thing," he'd said. "It takes someone extraordinary. That's exactly who you are." 24 years later, she'd proven that instructor wrong in every possible way. And today, though no one realized it yet, she'd begin correcting the thinking that had produced his comment in the first place. Jasmine stopped at the crew assignment board, already knowing her schedule but maintaining routine. Flight 2733, co-piloting with Captain Jackson Wilson. She'd heard about Wilson, everyone had. Decorated pilot, meticulous safety record, and according to quiet crew room talk, a man who'd managed to avoid flying with minority crew members through a suspiciously consistent pattern of last-minute reassignments. Today that pattern would end one way or another. "Ready to meet the famous Captain Wilson?" asked a passing flight attendant. Jasmine's smile revealed nothing of her true position or purpose. "More than ready," she replied. Captain Jackson Wilson began his pre-flight routine exactly as he had for the last 30 years, arriving precisely 75 minutes before departure, hanging his overcoat in the same locker he'd used since joining Meridian Airways, then Mountain West Airlines in 1994, and performing his first equipment check his own appearance in the crew room mirror. At 56, Wilson maintained the rigid posture of someone who believed authority came from physical bearing as much as rank. His uniform was immaculate brass buttons, polished 4 gold stripes, perfectly aligned tie, precisely centered. The gray at his temples had increased over the years, but he considered it an asset passengers trusted older pilots he'd often explained to younger captains he mentored. Trusted certain ones anyway. Wilson came from aviation royalty, father, a commercial captain, grandfather, a Wubby-Wub fighter pilot, uncle, an airline executive. Flying wasn't just his profession. It was his birthright. He'd grown up believing cockpits were sacred spaces entrusted only to those who'd earned their way through proper channels. In his mind, he wasn't preserving the old ways out of prejudice. He was maintaining standards in an industry increasingly focused on metrics other than pure merit. Of course, merit in Wilson's definition had specific parameters that somehow always disqualified certain candidates. Morning Captain called First Officer Derek Summers approaching with coffee in hand. "Beautiful day to fly." Wilson's expression warmed immediately. "Derek, thought you were on the Chicago-Atlanta leg today. Switched with Manning. His kid's in a school play." Good man Wilson clapped him on the shoulder. "Join me for the walk around. Been meaning to show you my pre-flight inspection technique. Might help when you upgrade to captain." This was the Wilson most of Meridian knew, mentor stickler for procedure, generous with knowledge to those he deemed worthy. As they entered the jet bridge, they passed flight attendant Sofia Rodriguez, collecting her crew materials. "Morning," she offered with professional courtesy. Wilson's acknowledgement was barely perceptible. A slight nod without eye contact, his expression cooling several degrees. The contrast between his warm interaction with Summers and cold response to Rodriguez wasn't lost on her. She'd seen it countless times. "Who's your FO today?" Summers asked as they approached the aircraft. Wilson checked his company phone. "Bennett," he replied, frowning slightly. "Don't know them?" Her Summers corrected casually. "Jasmine Bennett. Heard she's ex-military combat experience." Wilson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Military flying is different from commercial. Well, see if she's Meridian material." What Wilson didn't say, what he never said aloud, was that his definition of Meridian material had specific, immutable characteristics. In 30 years, he'd never completed a flight with a black pilot in his cockpit. Always found reasons: scheduling conflicts, sudden equipment, familiarity issues, last-minute swap requests, citing crew dynamic concerns. The system accommodated these requests without question from a pilot with his seniority. Inside, Wilson didn't consider himself prejudiced. He simply believed some people belonged in certain roles and others didn't. The fact that his mental categorization aligned perfectly with racial and gender lines was to him coincidental, a matter of tradition and proven formulas for success. Change was risk, and risk was unacceptable in aviation. As he performed his exterior inspection, running his hand along the massive Boeing 787's gleaming fuselage, Wilson was already formulating contingency plans. He'd developed a sixth sense for detecting when management might try to diversify his crew assignments. He knew exactly who to call, what phrases to use, how to ensure his cockpit remained the kind of environment he believed was safest. What he didn't know was that today those tactics would fail catastrophically, and that the aircraft he now touched so possessively belonged to the very woman he was preparing to reject. First Officer Miguel Ramirez stood in the crew lounge watching the snow accumulate outside while sipping the airport's mediocre coffee. At 42, the Hispanic pilot had navigated Meridian's unspoken hierarchy for 7 years. He'd learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and, most importantly, when to look the other way. Like when Captain Wilson mysteriously needed last-minute crew changes whenever scheduled with certain pilots. Miguel had never directly challenged these patterns. His strategy was advancement through excellence and patience. Rock the boat and your career path suddenly developed mysterious obstacles. He'd witnessed it happen to others. Miguel called head flight attendant Allison Taylor as she entered the lounge, her blonde hair pulled into a perfect regulation bun. At 47, Allison had mastered the airline's political landscape. You're with Wilson today. No just deadheading to Chicago. Bennett's his F.O. Allison's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. Bennett. Jasmine. Bennett. You know her flew with her last month. Allison hesitated, lowering her voice. She's... you know. The unfinished sentence hung between them. Miguel knew exactly what Allison meant, and his stomach tightened with the familiar discomfort of complicity. She's an excellent pilot, he said finally. Allison shrugged, adjusting her scarf. Wilson has certain expectations. Just saying today might get interesting. Across the terminal, Ground Operations Manager Thomas Hendricks scanned departure monitors with mounting concern. At 52, the former military man ran his domain with rigid efficiency. Weather was causing system-wide delays. The last thing he needed was crew conflicts. His phone vibrated. Wilson. Morning Captain Thomas answered. Hendricks need to discuss today's crew assignment. Thomas sighed internally. He knew exactly where this was going. Wilson had called him with similar concerns before. Each time, Thomas facilitated the requested changes, justifying it as maintaining harmony and schedule integrity. Path of least resistance. Let me guess, Thomas said. First Officer Bennett, you've seen her record. Wilson's voice carried the practiced tone of professional concern. Limited commercial experience. Weather's challenging today. Safety has to come first. Thomas glanced at his scheduling system. Captain were stretched thin with weather delays. Finding a replacement would be difficult. I'm sure you'll manage, Wilson replied, the slight edge in his voice making it clear this wasn't a request. After hanging up, Thomas hesitated before entering the crew reassignment system. This dance was becoming more frequent, more transparent. But challenging Wilson with his connections to executive leadership, his perfect safety record, and his seniority wasn't a battle Thomas was prepared to fight. In the first-class galley of the 787 flight attendant, Sofia Rodriguez organized her service cart with methodical precision. At 29, the Columbia University graduate had originally planned a career in journalism before falling in love with aviation. Her investigative instincts, however, remained intact. For months, she'd been documenting patterns. She observed which pilots were reassigned, which faced extra scrutiny, which received preferential treatment. The notes lived in an encrypted app on her phone, growing more comprehensive with each flight. Sophia, Allison appeared at the galley entrance. "Wilson's your captain today." "I know," Sophia replied neutrally. "Just follow his preferences, exactly. He hates when crew deviate from his expectations." Sophia nodded, keeping her thoughts private. She'd flown with Wilson enough to know his expectations varied dramatically depending on who you were. In airport operations, Director of Flight Operations Gregory Palmer reviewed the day's challenges from his corner office overlooking the tarmac. At 61, the white-haired former pilot had been Wilson's friend for decades, their careers advancing in parallel. When issues arose involving Wilson, and they did with increasing frequency, Gregory ensured they were resolved quietly. "Palmer," he answered his private line. "Greg Jackson here. Might need your intervention today." Gregory closed his eyes briefly. Another day, another intervention to protect Wilson from the consequences of his own behavior. Their friendship had become increasingly one-sided, with Gregory repeatedly using his authority to shield Wilson from changing company policies and expectations. "What now, Jackson? They've assigned me a co-pilot without adequate experience for today's conditions." Gregory knew better than to ask for specifics. In 30 years of friendship, certain topics remained carefully unaddressed between them. "He'll see what I can do." Across the hangar, Maintenance Chief Anthony Vasquez completed his final inspection of the aircraft bound for Chicago. At 48, the veteran mechanic noticed patterns invisible to most, including which captains consistently requested different aircraft when assigned certain crew members. "Perfect as always," Chief said, and approaching pilot Captain Wilson with First Officer Summers. "Thank you, sir," Anthony replied. "I heard you're taking her up in this weather." "Nothing I can't handle," Wilson said confidently. Anthony nodded, saying nothing about the crew assignment he'd seen on his tablet. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, even as he silently documented the inconsistencies he observed. At Gate B-18, passenger Eliza Johnson settled into a seat with clear view of the boarding desk. The 32-year-old black attorney traveled weekly for her corporate discrimination law practice. She'd developed a hypersensitivity to certain behavioral patterns, the slight shifts in expression tone and body language that often preceded discriminatory incidents. When she observed Captain Wilson's reaction upon first seeing First Officer Bennett approaching the gate, Eliza recognized the signs immediately. Her hand moved instinctively to her phone, ready to document whatever might unfold. Throughout the terminal, other passengers waited, business travelers tapping impatiently on laptops, families corralling excited children, college students with headphones. None realized they were about to witness a moment that would transform an industry. The Boeing 787's cockpit gleamed with technology, each switch and display representing years of human innovation, yet the humans operating them still carried centuries-old prejudices. Morning light streamed through the curved windshield, illuminating the intricate controls designed to transcend human limitations. The irony wasn't lost on Jasmine as she stood in the doorway observing the space she would soon occupy professionally in more ways than one. Outside Denver International Airport's distinctive white peaks rose against the gray winter sky like a mountain range of human aspiration. Snow continued falling, not yet heavy enough to halt operations, but sufficient to require de-icing and create system-wide delays. The distinctive scent of aviation fuel mingled with fresh coffee from first class. Passengers streamed through the terminal below each with their own deadlines, connections, and expectations. The cockpit still held Captain Wilson's presence, though he was currently outside completing his walk-around inspection. His leather flight bag occupied the captain's seat. A worn leather clipboard bearing the day's flight plan rested precisely centered on his side of the center console. Even his coffee mug bearing Meridian's original logo from before the rebranding marked his territory, placed exactly where it had been for countless flights. Jasmine absorbed these details, recognizing the subtle markers of routine and ownership. Her trained eye noted the immaculate organization, the positioning of backup charts within specific reach, the carefully arranged sequence of checklists. Wilson's cockpit reflected his personality, ordered, traditional, resistant to change. Beyond the physical environment lay the invisible architecture of Meridian Airways, a corporate culture in transition yet still anchored to outdated norms. Officially, Meridian embraced diversity and inclusion. Their marketing materials featured pilots of varied backgrounds, and their corporate communications highlighted commitment to equitable practices. Reality told a different story. Of Meridian's 843 pilots, only 27 were black. Just 9 were black women. Leadership positions showed even starker disparities, with every chief pilot position held by white men, most over 50. The pattern matched industry-wide statistics. Commercial aviation remained among America's least diverse professional fields, with less than 3% of airline pilots identifying as black. What made Meridian unique wasn't the disparity, but the careful maintenance of it. Unlike competitors who had implemented targeted recruitment programs and mentorship initiatives, Meridian relied on traditional hiring channels that perpetuated existing demographics. Change came slowly, if at all, protected by phrases like maintaining our culture and ensuring consistent standards. This wasn't the environment passengers experienced. To them, Meridian projected professionalism, safety, and modern efficiency. Their recently redesigned cabins featured soft blue lighting, ergonomic seating, and state-of-the-art entertainment systems. Customer-facing policies emphasized inclusivity and respect. The disconnect between passenger experience and internal reality was by design, a polished exterior concealing ingrained biases. Weather conditions added pressure to an already tense environment. The snow was falling heavier now, reducing visibility and complicating ground operations. Deasing trucks moved methodically between waiting aircraft, applying bright green fluid that steamed against cold fuselages. Inside operations centers, controllers and dispatchers calculated delays, rerouted connections, and managed the cascading complications of winter aviation. For passengers, weather delays were inconveniences. For crew, they created compression-tighter turnarounds, heightened scrutiny of efficiency, increased tension. In these pressure cooker environments, underlying biases often surfaced more visibly as stress eroded carefully maintained veneers. Flight 2733's manifest showed a full aircraft, 12 first-class A38 Premium Economy, 128 Economy. A high-revenue flight with numerous business travelers making important connections in Chicago. Exactly the type of service where disruptions created maximum visibility and financial impact. Throughout the terminal, passengers checked updates on their phones. Current status on time. They couldn't see the brewing conflict that threatened that status. Couldn't know that in the next hour their routine journey would become the flashpoint for industry-wide transformation. In crew rooms and operations centers throughout the building, Meridian employees moved through their pre-flight routines. Flight attendants reviewing service procedures, gate agents preparing boarding passes, ramp workers positioning for luggage loading. A complex choreography of human effort designed to create the illusion of effortless travel. For most flights, the machine functioned smoothly. But today, as Captain Wilson completed his exterior inspection and First Officer Bennett prepared to enter his domain, the gears of that machine were about to encounter unprecedented resistance. The stage was set, the players in position. In approximately 84 minutes, Flight 2733 was scheduled for departure. Whether it would leave on time or at all now depended on a power struggle about to unfold in a snowbound cockpit. If you've ever sensed tension between coworkers the moment you walked into a room, drop a comment below. The atmospheric pressure in this terminal was about to drop faster than altitude in an emergency descent. The pre-flight crew briefing room hummed with typical morning activity, pilots reviewing weather data, flight attendants discussing service details, the occasional burst of laughter cutting through professional conversation. Captain Wilson entered with his characteristic confident stride, nodding acknowledgments to senior crew members while ignoring others. His eyes scanned the room, locating Flight 2733's designated meeting area. First Officer Derek Summers stood nearby, still in conversation with Wilson following their walk-around inspection. "You're not on my flight," Wilson said, brow furrowing as he double-checked his tablet. "No, sir, just saying good morning." "Sir, just saying, I'm on the Atlanta run," Summers replied. "Then who's my—" Wilson's question trailed off as Jasmine Bennett approached her credentials folder and iPad in hand. "Good morning, Captain Wilson," she said, extending her hand. "First Officer Jasmine Bennett." Time seemed to freeze as Wilson stared at her outstretched hand. His expression shifted microscopically, a tightening around the eyes, a slight downward pull at the corners of his mouth. To most, these changes would be imperceptible. To Jasmine, who had navigated similar moments hundreds of times, they spoke volumes. "Bennett," he finally said, ignoring her hand and glancing down at his tablet. "Don't see your name in the system." "I was assigned yesterday," Jasmine replied evenly. "Should be updated by now." Wilson made a show of refreshing his schedule. "Showing Simmons as my FO. There was a swap due to a family emergency," Jasmine explained, maintaining her professional demeanor. "I can show you the confirmation." Around them, other crew members continued their conversations, but the pitch had changed slightly. Quieter attention, partially diverted to the interaction unfolding between Captain and First Officer. Wilson finally looked directly at her credentials folder still extended toward him. "You've flown the 787 before, yes, sir. Certified 4 years ago. Over 2,000 hours on type. With Meridian, and previously with United." Wilson's expression remained skeptical. "Military, yes. Air Force. F-16s primarily, then C-17s. Combat 3 tours." Each response came smoothly, confidently. Each was met with another question, another probe for weakness or inexperience. The pattern was familiar to Jasmine, the professional-sounding interrogation designed to establish a narrative of doubt. First Officer Miguel Ramirez watched from nearby, discomfort evident in his posture. Had witnessed this ritual before Wilson's systematic undermining of certain co-pilots before they even reached the aircraft. Most either requested reassignment after a few such encounters or found themselves removed through Wilson's back-channel maneuvers. Head Flight Attendant Allison Taylor approached flight manifest in hand. "Captain, we're showing a full flight today. Any special service notes?" Wilson turned to her with a completely different demeanor, warm, collegial, engaged. "Standard service, Allison. Though with this weather might want to prepare for turbulence after takeoff." "Of course." Her eyes flickered briefly to Jasmine, then back to Wilson. The silent communication between them was subtle but clear. "Is this going to be a problem?" Wilson's slight head movement provided the answer. "Yes, but he'll handle it." Jasmine observed the exchange with clinical detachment. Every interaction was data, every micro-expression evidence of a broader pattern. 18 years of flying 3 combat tours and 12,000 flight hours reduced to skin color in an instant. Wilson turned back to her. "Weather's challenging today. Heavy snow, potential icing conditions. Mountain turbulence expected." I reviewed the meteorological report, Jasmine responded. "The approach to Chicago shows moderate precipitation, but nothing unusual for O'Hare in February. Denver departure is the concern," Wilson countered. "Requires familiarity with mountain weather patterns, local knowledge. I was based in Colorado Springs for 3 years, sir." Each professional response seemed to frustrate Wilson further. His strategy of finding technical inadequacies was failing against Jasmine's exemplary qualifications. He glanced at his watch. "We should begin pre-flight. He'll need to verify your licenses and medical certification before we proceed." "Of course." Jasmine opened her credentials folder, revealing meticulously organized documentation, each license certification and training record precisely where regulations required. Wilson inspected each document with exaggerated thoroughness. Around them, other crews had begun moving toward their gates, the briefing room gradually emptying. Your Class 1 medical was renewed recently, Wilson noted, finding nothing out of order. Last month, Jasmine confirmed. Perfect health. Wilson closed the folder abruptly. There seems to be a misunderstanding. You're showing limited commercial experience with Meridian specifically. 3 years with Meridian, sir, all documented in my file. Wilson's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone, stepping slightly away. Excuse me a moment. Jasmine remained perfectly still as Wilson made a call, his voice deliberately lowered but still audible in the quiet room. This is Captain Wilson. I need to discuss today's crew assignment for Flight 2733. Yes, immediately. It's a safety concern. Sofia Rodriguez entered the briefing room, catching the end of Wilson's conversation. Her eyes met Jasmine's briefly, a look of recognition and resignation passing between them. Wilson ended his call and turned back to Jasmine. Wait here. There's a question about today's assignment I need to clarify with operations. Without waiting for a response, he strode from the room, leaving Jasmine standing alone with her credentials still in hand. Miguel approached cautiously. First time with Wilson? Yes, Jasmine replied simply. Miguel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Particular about his cockpit procedures. I've noticed. It's not personal, Miguel offered weakly, both of them knowing the statement was a lie. Jasmine smiled slightly. It always is, Miguel. Always has been. Outside, the snow continued falling, each flake another second, ticking away toward departure time. Have you ever watched someone search for reasons to reject you when they couldn't find fault with your qualifications? Comment below if this scene feels all too familiar. And if you want to see what happens next, hit that subscribe button. I cannot in good conscience operate this aircraft with an unproven first officer. Wilson's declaration echoed through the now nearly empty briefing room where he had returned with Ground Operations Manager Thomas Hendricks. Jasmine stood exactly where Wilson had left her, posture perfect, expression neutral. Only the slight tapping of her index finger against her credential folder betrayed any reaction to the unfolding situation. Thomas Hendricks looked profoundly uncomfortable, caught between corporate protocol and Wilson's forceful personality. Captain First Officer Bennett's qualifications exceed our requirements significantly. On paper, Wilson countered. Papers don't fly airplanes. Experience does. Real experience. 12,000 flight hours isn't real experience, Jasmine asked, voice calm, despite the blatant dismissal. Wilson turned to her with thinly veiled impatience. Look, military flying follows different protocols. Combat creates habits that don't translate to passenger service. And your commercial hours are spread across carriers' limited time with Meridian systems specifically. Captain Wilson Hendricks interjected her training records show perfect scores on all Meridian procedures and protocols. Simulator performance isn't real-world performance. Wilson insisted, running his hand through his graying hair. Today's conditions require experienced crew coordination. We're looking at potential severe icing mountain wave turbulence and reduced visibility. He gestured toward the windows where snow continued falling steadily. This isn't the day for training exercises. I'm not a trainee, Captain Jasmine stated firmly. I've operated in significantly worse conditions, both military and commercial. Wilson's expression hardened. There's a substantial difference between flying a fighter jet and responsible operation of a commercial airliner with 178 souls aboard. You're right, Jasmine agreed. The C-17s I commanded carried up to 200 military personnel, plus equipment often in active conflict zones with no ground support, minimal visibility, and hostile fire. Commercial flying is actually less demanding by comparison. The subtle shift in the room was palpable. Jasmine had countered Wilson's argument without direct confrontation, establishing her competence while remaining professionally composed. Wilson changed tactics. The issue isn't capability, but specifically experience with Meridian's operating procedures during irregular operations. Our airline has specific protocols that differ from military and even other commercial carriers. Which procedures specifically concern you? Captain Jasmine asked. The directness of her question momentarily stalled Wilson. He hadn't expected to be challenged to articulate specific concerns. Our de-icing procedures are proprietary, he finally said, as are our mountain wave turbulence mitigation techniques. Jasmine nodded thoughtfully before opening her iPad. Meridian Operational Bulletin 2022-47 details our de-icing procedures, which I reviewed this morning, and our turbulence protocols were updated in November's safety briefing. She displayed the documents on her screen. I've studied both thoroughly. Hendricks glanced at his watch nervously. Captain, we're approaching the 40-minute mark before departure. We need to make a decision. My decision is made, Wilson stated flatly. I need a first officer with appropriate Meridian-specific experience for today's conditions. Find Summers or Jenkins if they're available. Both are assigned to other flights, Hendricks replied. Then delay the flight until a suitable replacement is found. Jasmine stepped forward deliberately, entering Wilson's line of sight. Captain, may I ask a direct question? What specifically about my qualifications do you find unsuitable for today's flight? The question hung in the air, its simplicity devastating in its transparency. Wilson's discomfort was briefly visible before his expression hardened again. It's not about qualifications on paper. It's about cockpit dynamic and crew resource management. I need absolute confidence in my first officer's ability to support my command decisions without hesitation. And you've determined I lack this ability based on our 5-minute interaction. I've determined we lack the established communication pattern necessary for safe operation in today's conditions. Jasmine maintained eye contact. Captain Wilson, in the past 24 months, how many first officers have you rejected on similar grounds? Wilson's jaw tightened visibly. That's irrelevant. FAA safety regulations and Meridian's own policies suggest otherwise, Jasmine countered calmly. Pattern recognition is fundamental to safety culture. Hendricks interjected nervously. Let's focus on today's flight specifically. I am, Jasmine responded. I'm trying to understand if today's issue is truly about my qualifications or about something else entirely. The implication hung heavily in the room. Wilson's face flushed slightly. I don't appreciate what you're suggesting, First Officer Bennett. I'm not suggesting anything, Captain. I'm asking for clarity about your concerns regarding my qualifications so I can address them professionally. Wilson turned to Hendricks. This conversation is proving my point about communication difficulties. Find me another first officer. Hendricks hesitated, visibly torn between protocol and path of least resistance. Captain reassigning at this juncture would create significant delays. Then delay the flight, Wilson insisted. Safety isn't negotiable. Jasmine maintained her composed demeanor. I agree completely, Captain. Safety isn't negotiable, which is why arbitrary rejection of qualified crew members without specific safety concerns should be documented and reviewed. The word documented visibly triggered Wilson's concern. His eyes narrowed slightly. Are you threatening me, First Officer? Not at all, Captain. I'm following Meridian's safety reporting protocols, which require documentation of all decisions that impact scheduled operations, particularly those citing safety concerns. At that moment, Flight Attendant Sophia Rodriguez entered the briefing room. Excuse me, Captain Wilson. Passengers are beginning to arrive at the gate. They're asking about our departure status with the weather conditions. Wilson barely acknowledged her. We're handling a crew assignment issue. Sophia's eyes moved between Wilson Hendricks and Jasmine, quickly assessing the situation. Her hand moved subtly to her pocket where her phone was already recording audio, a habit she had developed after witnessing similar scenarios play out repeatedly. Ill-informed, the gate agents were still in pre-flight procedures, she said professionally, though her lingering presence made it clear she was now a witness to the unfolding conflict. "That would be appropriate," Jasmine responded when Wilson remained silent. "Please also note that Captain Wilson has expressed safety concerns about today's crew assignment that we're currently discussing." Sophia nodded, understanding the significance of creating an official record. "I'll update the flight log accordingly." Wilson's expression darkened further as he realized the confrontation was now being witnessed and potentially documented by additional crew members. "This isn't a public discussion," he stated firmly. "Safety concerns never should be private," Jasmine countered. Meridian's own protocols emphasize transparency in all safety-related decisions. The standoff had reached a critical juncture. Wilson, accustomed to his rejections being quietly accommodated through back channels, found himself cornered by Jasmine's calm insistence on procedure and documentation. Hendricks, increasingly uncomfortable, attempted to find middle ground. "Perhaps we should consult with Director Palmer." "That won't be necessary," Wilson interrupted. "My authority as captain is clear. I'm making an operational safety decision." "Which requires specific documentation," Jasmine reminded him. "Particularly when rejecting an assigned qualified crew member." The snow continued falling outside each flake another second, ticking away toward their scheduled departure. The tension in the room had transformed, no longer simply about one captain's prejudice, but about the structural methods that had long enabled such discrimination to function without consequence. Wilson, sensing his typical tactics failing, made a critical tactical error. "First Officer Bennett," he said, voice hardening, "your combative attitude demonstrates precisely why this crew pairing is unsuitable. Your failure to respect Captain's authority creates an unsafe command environment." The statement hung in the air, a clear escalation from questioning qualifications to attacking character. Jasmine's expression never changed, but her voice took on a new clarity. "I haven't been combative, Captain Wilson. I've requested specific safety concerns and cited company protocols. If requesting clarity constitutes combativeness, that raises significant questions about command culture." In that moment, Wilson realized he was losing control of a situation he'd managed effortlessly dozens of times before. His expression shifted from confidence to something rarely seen on his face, uncertainty. The weather delay that had initially seemed an ally in his rejection strategy now worked against him as more eyes focused on the unusual pre-flight delay. The private rejection he'd planned had transformed into a documented confrontation with witnesses. And still, First Officer Jasmine Bennett stood calm and composed, credentials in hand, qualified beyond question, exposing through her very presence a system that had functioned unchallenged for decades. Is it starting to feel like Wilson has met his match? Comment below with your prediction of what happens next. And if you're feeling that familiar tension in your chest, watching this power struggle unfold, hit that like button. Wilson's tactical approach shifted abruptly. If private rejection had failed, perhaps public scrutiny would succeed. He gestured toward the door with exaggerated courtesy. "Let's continue this discussion at the gate," he suggested, voice deliberately louder than necessary. "Since departure time is approaching." The calculation was transparent to Jasmine. Move the confrontation to a public space where professional disagreement might be misinterpreted as personal conflict. Create the impression of a difficult subordinate rather than a qualified pilot raising legitimate procedural concerns. "Of course, Captain," she agreed smoothly, gathering her materials. The walk through the terminal corridor created a visible spectacle. Captain Wilson striding purposefully ahead in his immaculate uniform, stars and stripes gleaming. First Officer Bennett following with perfect posture, her own uniform equally pristine. Thomas Hendricks hurrying alongside, looking increasingly distressed. Sophia Rodriguez trailing slightly behind, phone still recording in her pocket. At Gate B18, the scene was exactly as Wilson had hoped, crowded with passengers, many already watching the approaching crew with interest. Travel delays always heightened passenger awareness of crew movements. Now all eyes tracked their progress toward the gate counter. "Attention, folks," the gate agent was announcing. "Flight 2733 to Chicago is currently on time despite the weather, but we're monitoring conditions closely." Wilson approached the desk with practiced authority, positioning himself centrally where passengers could observe. His voice carried clearly. "We have a situation with today's flight assignment that requires immediate resolution." Jasmine remained perfectly positioned, neither retreating nor confronting, simply maintaining professional presence as passengers' attention focused on the unfolding scene. "This isn't about what you think it is," Wilson announced loud enough for nearby passengers to hear clearly. His implication was obvious, suggesting Jasmine was creating an unprofessional conflict rather than following safety protocols. Captain Hendricks interjected quietly. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Flight safety isn't a private matter," Wilson countered, voice still deliberately projected. "Passengers deserve transparency when operational decisions affect their travel." The calculated reversal of Jasmine's earlier point about transparency wasn't lost on her. Wilson was attempting to use her own professional standards against her, positioning himself as the reasonable authority figure dealing with a difficult situation. From her seat near the boarding desk, passenger Eliza Johnson recognized the dynamics immediately. As a discrimination attorney, she had documented similar scenarios across industries, the public undermining the strategic positioning, the leveraging of audience assumptions. Her phone was already recording. Captain Wilson, Jasmine said evenly, "I'm still waiting to hear your specific safety concerns about my qualifications." "This isn't about qualifications," Wilson replied, voice tight. "It's about crew resource management and cockpit communication, issues that are becoming increasingly evident." Several passengers had begun filming discreetly, sensing conflict. Wilson noted this with satisfaction, exactly the pressure he'd intended to create. Few confrontations survived public scrutiny, especially when one party held visible authority symbolized by uniform and rank. "To be clear," Jasmine responded, maintaining perfect composure, "you've identified no specific safety concerns with my technical qualifications, flight experience, or knowledge of procedures." The directness of her statement created an unexpected dynamic. Rather than appearing difficult, she seemed reasonable, asking simple professional questions that Wilson continued to evade. "Your tone and approach demonstrate the communication difficulties I've identified." Wilson insisted, though his own tone had grown noticeably sharper, while Jasmine's remained measured. "I apologize if my professional questions seem challenging," she replied. "Perhaps you could help me understand which questions specifically you find inappropriate." The strategic reversal forced Wilson into increasingly defensive responses. Each evasion made him appear less reasonable to the watching audience. Passenger Eliza Johnson stood approaching the desk. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm an attorney and am a bit concerned about what seems to be happening here." Wilson's expression tightened further. "This is an airline operational matter, ma'am, not a legal issue." "Actually," Eliza responded pleasantly, "I specialize in workplace discrimination law, and what I'm observing raises some significant questions." The intervention created exactly what Wilson had hoped to avoid: external validation of the problematic nature of his rejection. His strategy of public humiliation was backfiring dramatically. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't understand aviation safety protocols," Wilson stated firmly. "That's true," Eliza agreed. "But I do understand pattern recognition in professional settings, and I'd be very interested to know how many other first officers you've rejected with similar concerns." The question, nearly identical to Jasmine's earlier inquiry, landed with increased impact coming from an outside observer. Several more passengers had begun recording the confrontation, now drawing significant attention. Sophia stepped forward, addressing passengers directly. "Folks, we appreciate your patience as we finalize our pre-flight procedures. We'll update you on boarding status shortly." Her professional intervention created a moment's pause in the escalating situation. Wilson seized the opportunity to shift tactics again. "First Officer Bennett," he said, voice lowered but still audible to nearby passengers. This public disruption is exactly the type of judgment issue that concerns me. I haven't disrupted anything, Captain Jasmine replied calmly. I've simply requested clarity on safety concerns you've raised about my qualifications. The exchange continued, drawing attention. Nearby, a teenage passenger whispered to her mother, "Why won't he just answer her question?" Wilson heard the comment, his frustration visibly mounting as his strategy continued unraveling. Public scrutiny was working against, rather than for him, creating a documented record of his evasion rather than Jasmine's supposed insubordination. "This discussion is over," he finally declared. "Mr. Hendricks, please contact Director Palmer immediately. We need executive intervention." "Already done," Captain Hendricks replied quietly. "He's on his way." Jasmine remained perfectly composed, neither retreating nor advancing, simply maintaining her professional presence as Wilson's attempts at public humiliation transformed into a documented demonstration of exactly the discriminatory patterns she'd prepared to address. Around them, the terminal continued filling with delayed passengers. The snow fell steadily outside, and the power dynamic that Wilson had taken for granted for decades continued its unprecedented shift. If you've ever seen someone try to publicly humiliate someone else only to have it backfire spectacularly, drop a comment below. And if you're feeling that satisfaction of seeing Wilson's plan implode, hit that subscribe button to support stories of justice. Director of Flight Operations Gregory Palmer emerged from the elevator, his silver hair and authoritative bearing parting the crowd like a ship's bow through water. At 61, he carried the gravitas of a former captain combined with executive authority. His presence at a gate was rare enough to draw immediate attention from crew and passengers alike. Thomas Hendricks intercepted him before he reached the desk. "Sir, thank you for coming. We have a situation with aware." Palmer interrupted, eyes already fixed on Wilson. Jackson filled me in. The use of Wilson's first name wasn't lost on observing crew members, the personal connection between the men adding another dimension to the unfolding situation. Palmer approached the gate desk where Wilson stood with barely contained frustration, and Jasmine maintained her composed professional stance. Captain Wilson Palmer acknowledged with a nod. "First Officer Bennett." The slight hesitation before her name and rank revealed his predisposition. Director Jasmine replied with appropriate deference. "I understand we have an issue with today's crew assignment," Palmer stated, positioning himself beside Wilson in a subtle display of alliance. "Yes, sir," Wilson responded immediately. "I've expressed safety concerns about today's pairing given the weather conditions and First Officer Bennett's limited experience with Meridian's specific operating procedures." Palmer turned to Jasmine, speaking about her rather than to her. "First Officer Bennett's qualifications appear adequate on paper, but Captain Wilson's assessment of operational readiness must be respected. His safety record speaks for itself." The dismissal was expertly crafted, acknowledging her technical qualifications while undermining her operational readiness, all while avoiding direct engagement with her presence. Jasmine shifted slightly, deliberately placing herself within Palmer's direct line of sight. "Director Palmer, could you clarify which specific qualification or procedural knowledge Captain Wilson has found concerning I've requested this information repeatedly without response?" Her direct question created the same dilemma for Palmer that it had for Wilson: answer specifically, or expose the arbitrary nature of the rejection. Palmer chose deflection. Captain Wilson's authority to assess crew readiness is established in both FAA regulations and company policy. His judgment in these matters has proven reliable through 30 years of safe operations. "I don't question his authority," Jasmine clarified. "I'm seeking the specific safety concerns he's identified, so I can address them professionally." The reasonableness of her request continued, highlighting the unreasonableness of the rejection. Palmer glanced at Wilson, a flash of irritation crossing his features. This wasn't proceeding as the routine intervention he'd expected. From nearby passenger, Eliza Johnson continued observing and recording. First Officer Miguel Ramirez had also arrived at the gate, initially intending to board for his deadhead flight to Chicago, but now lingering as the confrontation escalated. Perhaps Palmer suggested with forced cordiality we should discuss this in my office rather than at the gate. "I'm concerned about timeline," Sir Jasmine replied professionally. "We're approaching 30 minutes to scheduled departure. Moving this discussion further delays resolution and impacts 178 passengers." Her response elegantly trapped Palmer, either acknowledge the delay his intervention was causing or address the substantive issue immediately. The safety concern Palmer stated with practiced authority relates to crew resource management in challenging conditions. Captain Wilson has determined that established communication patterns are essential for today's weather scenario. "And how does one establish such patterns without flying together?" Sir Jasmine inquired. The question hung uncomfortably in the air. Palmer's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "First Officer Bennett, your tone suggests insubordination." "I apologize if my professional questions seem challenging," Jasmine responded evenly. "I'm attempting to understand specific concerns so I can address them appropriately." Around them, the audience continued growing. Gate agents exchanged worried glances. Passengers whispered among themselves, many filming discreetly. What had begun as a private rejection attempt had transformed into a public referendum on leadership practices. Palmer, sensing the mounting public relations risk, attempted to regain control. "This discussion is counterproductive. In the interest of maintaining schedule integrity, we'll need to make a decision promptly." "I agree completely," Jasmine responded. "I've been ready to proceed with pre-flight procedures for 43 minutes. My qualifications meet or exceed all requirements for today's flight." The implicit timeline 43 minutes of delay caused not by her but by Wilson's rejection wasn't lost on the listening passengers. Nor was the fact that Palmer and Wilson continued avoiding the central question, what specific qualification or knowledge did she lack? "In my judgment," Palmer stated firmly, "the most efficient resolution is to assign an alternative first officer for today's flight." On what specific grounds? Jasmine persisted calmly. Palmer's patience visibly thinned. "First Officer Bennett, this continued questioning of leadership decisions demonstrates precisely the communication concerns Captain Wilson has identified." From the sidelines, Miguel Ramirez stepped forward unexpectedly. "Sir, with respect, I've observed this interaction from the beginning. First Officer Bennett has maintained complete professionalism while requesting standard clarification about safety concerns." Palmer turned to Miguel with surprise. "First Officer Ramirez, this doesn't involve you. Safety culture involves every pilot." "Sir," Miguel replied, his voice steady, despite his obvious discomfort with confrontation. "If specific concerns exist about First Officer Bennett's qualifications, we should all understand them for learning purposes." The unexpected alliance shifted the dynamic again. Palmer and Wilson now faced not just Jasmine's composed questioning, but another pilot's professional concern. Eliza Johnson chose this moment to approach again. "Excuse me, Director Palmer. I've been observing this situation and I'm concerned about what appears to be a pattern of differential treatment." Palmer's expression hardened. "Mom, this is an internal airline matter." "Actually," Eliza countered politely as a ticketed passenger whose flight is being delayed by what appears to be discriminatory practices, "it directly affects me and 177 other customers." The escalation continued, building more witnesses, more documentation, more questions, focusing on the central issue that Palmer and Wilson desperately wanted to avoid, the arbitrary nature of the rejection based on characteristics rather than qualifications. Palmer made a critical tactical error. "First Officer Bennett, your limited experience with this specific aircraft type in winter conditions creates valid safety concerns." The statement was exactly what Jasmine had been waiting for, a specific claim that could be directly refuted with evidence. "Director Palmer," she responded immediately, "my records indicate 473 hours on the 787, specifically including 847 hours in winter conditions across 3 airlines. This exceeds Captain Wilson's current 787 winter operations, experienced by approximately 200 hours. The specificity of her response, delivered without reference to notes, created a devastating counterpoint to the vague, shifting justifications offered by Wilson and Palmer. Sofia Rodriguez, still recording discreetly, noticed the growing attention from passengers throughout the gate area. What had begun as a localized confrontation was expanding into a terminal-wide spectacle as delayed travelers from other flights drifted toward the unfolding drama. Palmer, increasingly aware of the public relations disaster developing, attempted one final authoritative intervention. "This discussion is closed," he announced firmly. "For today's flight, we will assign First Officer Jenkins as a replacement. First Officer Bennett will report to my office tomorrow morning to discuss this situation further." But the dynamics had shifted too significantly for such a unilateral conclusion. The arbitrary nature of the rejection had been too thoroughly exposed through the persistent professional questioning that both Wilson and Palmer had failed to answer directly. As passengers continued recording, as crew members exchanged meaningful glances, as Jasmine maintained her composed professional stance, the administrative intervention that was supposed to quietly resolve the problem had instead illuminated it with uncomfortable clarity. Is there anything more satisfying than watching someone try to use their authority to shut down a legitimate question only to have it backfire? Drop a comment if you've ever witnessed a similar power struggle. And if you're waiting for the moment when Wilson finally realizes who he's really dealing with, hit that like button. Evidence of a deeply entrenched pattern began emerging with uncomfortable clarity as the confrontation continued. Flight attendant Sofia Rodriguez approached Thomas Hendricks, phone in hand, her expression professionally neutral despite the significance of what she was about to share. "Mr. Hendricks," she said quietly, "I believe these records may be relevant to today's operational decision." On her screen, a meticulously documented spreadsheet tracking Wilson's flight assignments over the past 2 years. The pattern was unmistakable once visualized of 43 scheduled pairings with minority pilots. 41 had resulted in last-minute reassignments. In contrast, 0 of his 187 pairings with white male pilots had been rejected. Hendricks' expression shifted from dismissive to concerned as he scrolled through the data. "Where did you get this?" "I've been tracking crew assignments," Sofia replied simply. Pattern recognition is fundamental to safety culture. The deliberate echo of Jasmine's earlier statement wasn't lost on Hendricks. His eyes moved from the phone to Wilson, then to Palmer, the implication sinking in. Nearby, Miguel Ramirez had made a decision that would alter his career trajectory permanently. He stepped forward, addressing Palmer directly. "Director, I need to report a safety concern according to Meridian's open reporting policy." His voice remained steady despite his obvious discomfort. "I've observed Captain Wilson reject 8 minority co-pilots in the past 24 months, each time citing vague communication or experience concerns that weren't applied to white co-pilots with identical or lesser qualifications. The public statement from a respected pilot, rather than a difficult first officer, created a seismic shift in the confrontation's dynamics." Palmer's expression tightened with the recognition that the situation had escalated beyond containment. From the gathered passengers, Eliza Johnson nodded in professional recognition of the legal significance of a second employee corroborating the pattern. Other minority crew members throughout the gate area exchanged knowing glances with Jasmine. The silent acknowledgement spoke volumes. This wasn't an isolated incident, but the public exposure of experiences many had endured privately. Anthony Vasquez, maintenance chief, approached from the jet bridge where he'd been overseeing de-icing preparations. He hesitated briefly before addressing Hendricks. "Sir, my maintenance logs might be relevant," he said quietly. "I've noted that Captain Wilson has requested aircraft inspections or equipment checks disproportionately when assigned minority crew. The pattern is statistically significant across 36 months of data. The accumulating evidence created mounting pressure on Palmer and Wilson, each piece revealing not isolated incidents but a comprehensive pattern suggesting institutional knowledge and enablement. Palmer attempted to regain control of the narrative. These allegations are serious and will be investigated appropriately. However, today's immediate operational decision remains. Director Palmer Jasmine interjected calmly. Given the emerging evidence of potential bias affecting safety decisions, shouldn't today's crew assignment be reviewed by an objective third party rather than the individuals implicated in the pattern? The reasonable question created another impossible dilemma: either acknowledge the legitimacy of the concern or dismiss mounting evidence of discriminatory practices affecting safety decisions. From his position beside Palmer Wilson's, complexion had paled noticeably. The confident captain who had initiated this confrontation now seemed increasingly uncertain as control slipped inexorably away. "This is becoming a spectacle," Palmer's stated voice hardening. "Well, continue this discussion privately." With respect, Sir Jasmine responded, "Privacy has enabled this pattern to continue unchallenged for years. Meridian's own safety protocols emphasize transparency in operational decisions, particularly those affecting crew assignments." Her persistent return to official policy and professional standards continued framing the confrontation, not as personal grievance, but as legitimate safety concern, precisely what Wilson and Palmer couldn't easily dismiss. Passenger recording had increased significantly, with Eliza Johnson now openly documenting the exchange. As a discrimination attorney, she noted clearly for her recording, "I'm observing what appears to be real-time evidence of a pattern of differential treatment based on protected characteristics." The legal framing of the situation elevated concerns further. Palmer glanced at his watch, then toward the growing crowd of observers. "First Officer Bennett," he said, attempting to regain authority, "report to my office immediately. Well, resolve this matter away from the gate. Sir, my assigned duty is Flight 2733 to Chicago." Jasmine replied evenly, "Diverting me to your office without specific cause would create further operational delays for 178 passengers." The response, perfectly professional while highlighting the operational impact of their intervention, maintained the pattern of reasonable policy-based responses that continued exposing the arbitrary nature of the rejection. Wilson, increasingly agitated by his inability to control the situation, made another critical error. This continued insubordination demonstrates exactly why Captain Miguel interrupted respectfully. First Officer Bennett hasn't been insubordinate. She's followed Meridian's safety protocols by requesting specific clarification of safety concerns affecting crew assignment. The intervention from another pilot, particularly one who had previously remained silent in similar situations, visibly shocked Wilson. The alliance he'd expected from fellow pilots was fracturing before his eyes. Sophia stepped forward again, this time addressing passengers directly. "Folks, we appreciate your patience during this pre-flight safety discussion. We'll update you on boarding status shortly." Her calm professionalism contrasted sharply with Wilson and Palmer's increasingly evident discomfort. The balance of perceived authority had shifted dramatically from command hierarchy to evidence-based inquiry. As the confrontation continued, a subtle transformation occurred among observing crew members. Whispered conversations emerged. Phones appeared, recording discreetly. The witnesses to Wilson's behavior, who had previously remained silent out of career preservation, began finding courage in collective observation. Palmer, recognizing the deteriorating situation, attempted one final authoritative intervention. "This discussion is closed, pending formal review. First Officer Jenkins will be assigned to Flight 2733. First Officer Bennett is temporarily reassigned pending investigation." The unilateral pronouncement might have ended the matter in previous years, but the documented pattern, the multiple witnesses, the passenger recordings, and Jasmine's unwavering professional composure had created an unprecedented scenario. Director Palmer Jasmine responded calmly, given the evidence of potentially biased decision-making affecting flight operations. I'm required by FAA regulations to file an immediate safety report before accepting reassignment. The statement, absolutely accurate regarding regulatory requirements, created another impossible dilemma. Preventing required safety reporting constituted a serious regulatory violation. The safety report, she continued, will necessarily include all evidence presented here regarding patterns of crew rejection that may have compromised safety culture. The implications were clear. Forcing her reassignment would trigger formal investigation of the patterns now extensively documented by multiple sources. As Palmer calculated his response, Maintenance Chief Anthony Vasquez approached again, tablet in hand. "Director Palmer," he said respectfully, "de-icing is complete and the aircraft is certified ready for departure. Meteorological reports indicate our departure window is optimal now, before heavier snowfall begins in approximately 40 minutes. The operational update added time pressure to the already tense situation. Each minute of delay increased costs, passenger inconvenience, and potential media attention." Palmer found himself trapped between Wilson's increasingly indefensible position and the mounting evidence of institutional discrimination affecting safety decisions, all unfolding under the watchful eyes and recording devices of dozens of witnesses. What had begun as a routine rejection of a minority pilot through established back channels had transformed into a public referendum on leadership practices that had operated unchallenged for decades. And through it all, First Officer Jasmine Bennett maintained perfect professional composure, exposing through her very presence and measured responses a system that could only function in shadows and silence. We all recognize that moment when someone suddenly realizes they're not just losing an argument, they're exposing an entire corrupt system. Drop a comment if you've seen that moment of dawning horror before. And if you can feel that the balance of power is about to shift dramatically, hit that like button and get ready. Either she goes or I don't fly. Wilson's ultimatum cut through the tense atmosphere at Gate B-18, his voice carrying clearly to the gathered passengers and crew. The statement, delivered with absolute certainty, represented Wilson's final tactical approach. Having failed to achieve rejection through qualifications questioning public humiliation or administrative intervention, he now leveraged the ultimate power of a captain refusing to operate the flight. Gregory Palmer's expression revealed the corner they'd been backed into. The operational implications were significant. Finding another captain on short notice during weather delays would be nearly impossible. Canceling the flight entirely would create cascading disruptions throughout the system. Captain Palmer said quietly, leaning close to Wilson, "Consider the implications here." "I have," Wilson replied firmly. "My decision is final." Jasmine observed the exchange with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. This moment, the breaking point, was precisely what she'd anticipated when she'd chosen today's. Flight this captain, this weather scenario. The gathered audience had grown substantially. Delayed passengers from other flights had drifted toward the unfolding drama. Airline staff from adjacent gates watched with unconcealed interest. The confrontation had transformed from operational dispute to public spectacle. Palmer turned to address the situation, his expression settling into practiced crisis management. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Due to operational considerations, Flight 2733 will require a crew adjustment before departure. We're working to minimize disruption." From the assembled passengers, a voice called out, "Why not just let the qualified co-pilot fly?" The direct question, cutting through corporate euphemism, elicited murmurs of agreement from other passengers. The public narrative was forming in real time, shaped not by corporate communications, but by observed behavior. Palmer ignored the question, turning to Hendricks. "Contact scheduling immediately. We need a replacement captain." Wilson's expression shifted to shock. "Replacement captain? I'm not the problem here. The flight needs to depart," Palmer replied tersely. You've refused to fly because of legitimate safety concerns, which you've been unable to articulate specifically despite multiple opportunities. Palmer responded, his frustration finally showing. The private loyalty that had protected Wilson for decades was fracturing under public scrutiny. Passenger Eliza Johnson stepped forward again. "Excuse me, Director Palmer. As someone who flies Meridian weekly, I'd like to understand why a qualified pilot is being prevented from doing her job without any specific safety concern being identified." The direct question from a high-value customer created another pressure point. Palmer's expression tightened further. "Mom, I assure you we're addressing this situation according to company protocols." Which protocols specifically, Eliza pressed. "As an attorney specializing in workplace discrimination, I'm professionally interested in how Meridian handles these situations." The legal framing elevated concerns further. Palmer glanced at his watch. 43 minutes behind schedule, 178 passengers waiting, 12 connecting flights at risk. Flight attendant Sophia Rodriguez approached, tablet in hand. "Director Palmer, passengers are inquiring about connection impact. Chicago arrivals shows potential gate conflicts if we're delayed further." The operational update added urgency to an already volatile situation. Palmer turned to Hendricks. "Status on replacement, Captain." "None available for at least 2 hours." Hendricks replied quietly. "Weather delays have committed all reserves." The breaking point had arrived. Either accept Jasmine as qualified first officer or cancel a high-revenue flight during peak business travel hours with dozens of witnesses documenting every moment of the decision process. First Officer Miguel Ramirez, who had remained nearby observing the escalating situation, made another unexpected intervention. "Director Palmer," he said respectfully, "I believe the operational solution is clear. First Officer Bennett is fully qualified. Captain Wilson has identified no specific safety concerns despite multiple opportunities. The aircraft is ready, weather window is optimal, and passengers need to reach their destinations." The reasonable summary from another respected pilot further isolated Wilson's position as arbitrary rather than safety-based. Palmer turned to Wilson, speaking quietly but intensely. "Jackson, you've put us in an impossible position. Either fly with Bennett or submit your resignation." "My resignation?" Wilson's voice rose in disbelief. "After 30 years? Because I raised legitimate safety concerns? Because you've created a public relations disaster with significant legal exposure?" Palmer corrected sharply. "This isn't private anymore." The air in the terminal seemed to still. The confrontation had reached its climax. Wilson, accustomed to absolute authority, found himself cornered by the very public transparency he'd tried to use against Jasmine. His expression cycled through emotions: shock, anger, betrayal, and finally calculation. "Fine," he stated coldly. "He'll operate the flight under protest. But this isn't over." Jasmine, who had remained silent during this exchange, spoke with perfect professional composure. "Captain Wilson, are you formally withdrawing your safety concerns regarding my qualifications?" The direct question forced explicit reversal of his previous position, another calculated move that further exposed the arbitrary nature of the original rejection. Wilson's jaw tightened visibly. "For operational necessity, yes." "Thank you," Captain Jasmine replied evenly. "He'll prepare the cockpit for departure." For 3 full seconds, absolute silence fell over the gate area. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of anticipation. In that silence, the balance of power shifted completely. As she turned toward the jet bridge, Jasmine's hand moved casually to her phone. A single text message went out to an unlisted number. "Proceeding as anticipated. Phase 1 complete." On the receiving end, in a corporate office 3 blocks from the airport, Jasmine's executive assistant, Nia Thompson, smiled slightly. "It's happening," she said to the assembled team. "Initiate Phase 2. Back at Gate B-18, the tension remained palpable as Wilson followed Jasmine toward the aircraft, his rigid posture betraying his internal fury. Palmer watched them go, already calculating the damage control required, unaware that the true revelation was yet to come. The passengers, sensing resolution, began gathering belongings in anticipation of boarding. Many continued filming, intuiting that the drama wasn't yet complete. As Jasmine walked down the jet bridge, her expression remained professionally neutral. But inside, the countdown had begun. In exactly 47 minutes, Captain Jackson Wilson would discover that the black woman he'd just humiliated in front of the entire flight crew didn't just outrank him. She owned every aircraft in the fleet, including the one they were about to board. The storm outside continued, gathering strength, snow falling in thickening sheets. But the true tempest was about to break inside Flight 2733's cockpit. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you held the ultimate trump card, but waited for exactly the right moment to play it? Comment below with your story. And if you're ready to see Wilson's world completely collapse, hit that subscribe button right now. The cockpit of the Boeing 787 hummed with tense silence as Captain Wilson and First Officer Bennett completed pre-flight procedures with mechanical precision. Their communication was minimal, strictly limited to essential checklist items. The professionally necessary exchanges only highlighted the personal chasm between them. Before start, checklist complete. Jasmine noted her voice maintaining the same calm composure she'd displayed throughout the confrontation. Wilson acknowledged with a curt nod, his movements sharp with barely contained fury. The humiliation of being forced to fly with her after his public refusal radiated from him like heat from an overworked engine. Outside, ground crew completed final preparations. Dicing trucks had withdrawn their work, finished as the brief weather window Palmer had mentioned remained open. In the cabin, flight attendants prepared for departure, passengers settled into seats, and the expected rhythm of air travel resumed despite the delayed start. Only the atmosphere in the cockpit betrayed the extraordinary events that had preceded boarding. Wilson performed his duties with rigid professionalism, but his sideways glances at Jasmine revealed his undiminished resentment. Requesting pushback clearance, Wilson stated into his headset, addressing ground control. The response came promptly. Meridian 2733 pushback approved. Contact ground on 121.9 when ready to taxi. As Wilson acknowledged, Jasmine casually checked her phone one final time before placing it in airplane mode, a seemingly routine action that triggered the cascade of events Shed methodically planned for months. 3 blocks away, in a nondescript office building housing Meridian Airways Regional Operations Center, Nia Thompson received the signal. Phase 2 initiated, she confirmed to the assembled team. Timeline is active. Back in the cockpit, pushback had begun. The massive aircraft edged slowly backward from the gate, tug engaged, preparing to begin its journey to Chicago. The point of no return, both literally and figuratively, approached. Ground Meridian 2733, ready to taxi. Wilson stated once pushback completed. Before ground control could respond, an unexpected voice came through their headsets. Meridian 2733, stand by. Operations override in effect. Wilson frowned, glancing at Jasmine. What override? She maintained her professional demeanor. I'm not aware of any scheduled operational test, Captain. The radio crackled again. Captain Wilson, this is Director Palmer. Return to gate immediately for crew adjustment. Wilson's expression shifted from confusion to vindication. Sounds like someone finally came to their senses about this crew pairing. Jasmine's expression remained unchanged as Wilson maneuvered the aircraft back to the gate with evident satisfaction. His smugness grew palpable, clearly believing the system had finally corrected itself in his favor. As the aircraft docked at the gate, Palmer's voice came through again. Captain Wilson, leave the aircraft immediately and report to my office. The certainty in Wilson's expression faltered. What? Why, that's an order. Captain. Wilson turned to Jasmine with renewed suspicion. What did you do? My job. Captain, she replied simply. Nothing more. The cabin door reopened as Palmer himself appeared at the cockpit entrance, his expression grave. "Captain Wilson, you need to come with me now." "What is this about Wilson?" demanded remaining seated. "It's about ownership," Palmer replied cryptically, as Wilson reluctantly unbuckled his harness. Jasmine reached inside her flight bag, retrieving an elegant leather portfolio embossed with Meridian's logo. She opened it deliberately, revealing official corporate documents. "Before you leave, Captain Wilson," she said calmly, "there's something you should know." The cockpit fell into absolute silence. For 3 full seconds, the world held its breath. Even the air seemed to pause as the moment of revelation arrived. 47 minutes ago, Jasmine continued. "While you were publicly questioning my qualifications, the Meridian Airways Board concluded an emergency session. These documents formalize the leadership transition that has been quietly underway for 6 months. Wilson's expression remained confused. "What leadership transition?" "The one that began when Bennett Aviation Holdings acquired controlling interest in Meridian Airways," Jasmine explained, her voice steady. "The acquisition was completed through a series of investment vehicles to allow observation of operational culture before implementing structural changes." The blood drained from Wilson's face so rapidly it was as if gravity had doubled. His hand, which had been tightly gripping the armrest, suddenly went limp. His eyes widened to an almost comical degree, pupils dilating in shock. The clipboard he'd been clutching clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the silent cockpit like a gunshot. "Bennett Aviation Holdings. My company," Jasmine confirmed simply. Palmer, standing in the cockpit doorway, added quietly, "She doesn't just outrank you, Jackson. She owns the airline." The silence that followed was absolute, not the absence of sound, but the presence of realization. Wilson stared at the documents, then at Jasmine, comprehension dawning with devastating clarity. His world hadn't just shifted. It had completely inverted, like an aircraft rolling from level flight into a vertical dive without warning. "That's not possible," he finally managed. "It's not just possible," Jasmine replied. "It's been registered with the SEC for 6 months. These particular documents, however, are more immediately relevant to your situation." She slid the portfolio toward him. The top page bore the official Meridian letterhead with today's date. Effective immediately, Jasmine continued. "Your active flight status is suspended pending comprehensive review of crew assignment patterns identified during pre-acquisition monitoring." Wilson's shock transformed to anger. "This is retaliation." "No," Captain Jasmine corrected calmly. "This is accountability. Your documented pattern of rejecting qualified minority pilots, including 8 in the past 24 months, constitutes a serious safety culture violation that requires thorough investigation." Palmer shifted uncomfortably. "Jackson, I think you should." "You knew about this?" Wilson interrupted, betrayal evident in his voice. "I was informed 10 minutes ago," Palmer admitted. The board voted unanimously. The power shift was now complete from Wilson's confident rejection of a supposedly subordinate pilot to his own suspension by the airline's actual owner. His world had inverted in less than an hour. "This is a setup," Wilson stated flatly. "You deliberately concealed your position to create this situation." "No, Captain," Jasmine countered. "I simply performed my assigned duties while you created this situation through your own actions and decisions. Every opportunity was provided for you to evaluate my qualifications professionally rather than demographically." Each word landed with precision, neither accusatory nor triumphant, simply factual. The restraint in her response highlighted the lack of restraint in his earlier behavior. "You're finished at Meridian," Wilson stated, a final attempt to assert vanished authority. "Actually," Jasmine replied with the same even tone, "I'm just getting started. And Meridian is about to experience significant cultural transformation." For a brief moment, Jasmine considered her options. She could destroy Wilson's career with a single word, could humiliate him as he'd tried to humiliate her. The temptation lasted exactly 3 seconds before her greater vision reasserted itself. This wasn't about one man's prejudice. It was about transforming an entire industry that had enabled such behavior for decades. She gestured toward the door. "Security will escort you from the aircraft. Your personal items will be collected and delivered to you." As if on cue, 2 uniformed security officers appeared behind Palmer. The choreography of the moment, perfectly timed and executed, underscored the comprehensive planning behind what Wilson had dismissed as a routine crew assignment. "This isn't over," Wilson stated as he rose from the captain's seat. "On that point, Jasmine agreed. We are in complete agreement." As Wilson exited the cockpit, security officers flanking him, Palmer following behind, the transformation was complete. The domain Wilson had jealously guarded against change now belonged in every sense to the very woman he had attempted to exclude. Jasmine remained seated, allowing a single moment of private reflection before returning to perfect professionalism. She activated the cabin announcement system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Bennett. We apologize for the delay in our departure. We're completing a required crew adjustment and will begin boarding our new captain shortly. Thank you for your patience." Her voice, steady, authoritative, reassuring, carried through the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the gate confrontation exchanged glances, sensing the resolution without knowing its full dimensions. In the cockpit, Jasmine pressed her company phone's speed dial. "NIA Phase 2 complete. Prepare Phase 3 documentation for immediate implementation." The power shift wasn't merely symbolic. It was structural, comprehensive, and, most importantly, irreversible. Wilson's authority hadn't just been challenged, it had been completely dismantled, replaced by a new reality he'd never imagined possible. Is there anything more satisfying than seeing someone's world collapse after they've spent decades abusing their power? Comment below with your reactions to this moment of justice. And if this revelation has you feeling that rush of vindication, hit that subscribe button right now. The rest of the script continues with all formatting changes applied. If you've witnessed someone turn discrimination into transformation, this story shows how one person's courage can change an entire industry. Hit that subscribe button right now if you want to see more stories of justice that don't just inspire, they transform. Drop a like if you felt that surge of satisfaction when Wilson realized who he was really dealing with. And share this video with someone who needs to see what real leadership looks like in the face of discrimination. Remember, qualifications matter more than expectations, and one person standing firm can lift an entire industry higher.